Alright, you guys have been begging for it. It's time to paint some Men of the Empire. Welcome back to Envelope of Doom Miniatures. My name is Deets and Happy New Year to you all. We made it all through 2023 and here is the first video of 2024. Now I got a few requests last year to paint Men of the Empire, so that is what we're going to do today. We're finally getting around to it and I'm going to do this fairly big batch paint. And actually one of the hardest batch paints I've had to do because I went through 2 natural disasters to get this thing done. But stay tuned, I'll tell you more about that soon. Now this box of Empire Archers isn't too old compared to some of the other miniatures I've been painting. Usually I just stick to the monopose ones and paint them like a mindless zombie, and it makes life a bit easier. This kit comes with a fair few pieces, so it's going to be a little bit different. Now there are a fair few Empire provinces, cities and states colours to choose from, so I put the question out to you guys asking what you wanted me to paint, and like moths to the flame, and as I predicted, everyone pretty much went with Averland. But I'm very happy to do this because I haven't really painted a black and yellow paint scheme before, so it's going to be pretty interesting to find out how this one turns out. But that's enough gas bagging, let's get straight into it. Now this kit comes with 2 sprues and a lot of options, so you can really mix it up and build and customize each mini. There are plenty of heads and weapons, so if you're wanting to build a Mordheim warband, I couldn't recommend this box of archers enough. It even comes with a wounded orc, which I'll probably use for something fun in the future video. I'm going to stick to the builds that are on the box art, but I will swap out a few of the head options because I didn't want every single one to have a beard. If I had to paint a million beards, I'd be here forever. I carefully went through the sprue and trimmed out each body part, and at points I was a little confused because some of the arms were very similar, but I just persisted and I found the right arms and the right legs for each one. I gave them a quick cleanup, tried to remove all the mold lines with my hobby knife, and then it was time to glue. Now if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know my favorite hobby tool is the toothpick. This thing is the best. You can use it for painting stars, you can use it for scraping things away, you can use it for cleaning up little bits and pieces here and there. It's just so versatile, so I highly recommend going out and getting a pile of toothpicks. Today I'm just going to use it for gluing, but it just really makes it easy to glue. You can kind of get a little bit more control with it. Each piece fit together pretty well, but if I did have more time, I'd probably use some green stuff just in the gaps here and there, but I've got models to paint, so I had to move on, unfortunately. So when I got to this point, I realized that the heads were going to kind of get in the way of the collar and around the leather parts. So what I decided to do was just paint them separate from the bodies and make life a bit easier. I just drilled a little hole in the bottom of each head and using a small amount of super glue, stuck them onto some wire and a container which I used for a handle. And now the minis are ready for a prime and I just use Wraithbone. So everything is pretty much ready for a coat of paint, but what I'm going to do first is paint the faces, get them out of the way, get the hard parts out of the way first, and then I'll focus on the larger bodies and stuff. I apply a couple thin coats of Cadian flesh all over each face, and I'm not really too concerned if I get this on the hats or the hair because I can fix that up later. There were a range of diverse heads to get through, and each one was really unique, and this kind of made the process a little bit more interesting for me. I then slapped on a wash of Guilliman flesh all over the heads, making sure there's pools in all the recesses. Next I mixed up half Cadian flesh, half Kislev flesh, and applied that to all the raised areas of the faces. I slowly mix in more Kislev flesh to the mix and build these highlights up until it's pure Kislev flesh. For a final highlight, I mix 1 part Pallid Witch flesh to 1 part Kislev flesh and just do a spot highlight on the nose and above the eyebrows. For a more in-depth tutorial on faces, make sure you check out my Guide to Painting Faces video. It has illustrations and learning aids, and it gets straight to the point. I finally got some good shots on how I paint eyes, and it only took me 28 videos to get here. I go over each eye with dried bark using the side of my brush. I go back over with some white, being super careful, and last up I just do a small dot of dried bark right in the middle. Eyes do take some practice. Don't ever feel like you're failing at mini painting if you struggle to do them. It takes me a lot of time to do them right and I still haven't perfected them. So as there are 10 unique Averland boys to paint, I wanted them to all be pretty unique. So what I decided to do was give them 4 different hair colors. And the colors I decided to go with were brown, gray, black, and like a sandy blonde color as well. What I'll do is I'll put the list of colors that I used in the order that I use them up for you now. So screenshot this list if you want to try recreate what I did here. I used a layer, highlight, wash, and then a final layer technique for the brown and blonde hair, and then a simple layer and highlight up technique for the grey and black hair. Painting like this does take time, but I feel like the end result is worth it because each mini looks like an individual. So some of these dudes had some fun furry hats, so I used dried bark as the base, and then used some Vallejo Beastie Brown as a highlight to each of the raised parts of the fur. And then to finish, I just used some Baylor Brown as a final highlight just to the tips. So I was making some good progress with these guys and then this happened. A cyclone ripped straight through the region where I live. Luckily enough there was no major damage in the region, it just meant I had to put the paintbrushes down for a few days and there was a little bit of a cleanup, but that was okay. Now I was chomping at the bit to get some more paint on these guys, and I bet you're chomping at the bit to see them finish. But before we do that, please hit the like and the subscribe button just to stay up to date with all my latest videos. When painting, I always look for some inspiration and I always have a reference image handy. And for these guys, I had the Von Kragsberg guard illustration by David Gallagher up on my monitor so I could get a good feel for the Averland aesthetic. So moving on to the layers on the body now, and for my yellow base color, I use some Vallejo bronze flesh tone, and I'm going to paint that on the left side of the body on each model, and then apply it to the right leg. Just like the image seen here, they're kind of opposite. I also apply this color to parts of the hats. I then apply a couple thin coats of Abaddon black to the left leg and the right side of the body, and I throw some of this on the capped part of the hat. Now these guys have some pretty trendy leather coats on as well as some leather belts and shoes, so I'm going to try and make each leather a little bit different so it doesn't look like one brown blob. I mix half dried bark to half Doombull brown and put this all over the leather jacket parts, just the main area. Next I use pure dried bark on the belts, shoes and the pouches. And for the weapon handles, I just use some corn red. Thankfully there isn't too much metallic metal going on with these guys, so I just go over the swords, the chest plates, the little helmet bits and the arrows with some gunmetal. Then I use a couple thin coats of Gehenna's gold for the sword hilts and the guards. Okay, so we're going pretty well, and then another disaster struck. A record flood hit the area I lived in, and I well and truly had to put the paints down this time. This kind of threw a spanner in the works for me as well and slowed me down again, and when I tried to get back to the table I really didn't feel like painting anymore. I needed a bit of a break, so what I decided to do was take a week off over Christmas. Unfortunately there was no videos over Christmas as well, and just kind of get my bearings back and do things that I enjoyed and try be happy, because what was happening around me wasn't that great of a time. But then again, I watched a few movies, ate some good food, had a great time over Christmas, and I was ready to get straight back into painting, so I jumped straight back on the horse and got back into it. It's time to now slap on some washes, and like always for my yellow, I use Seraphim Sepia straight out of the pot, and I apply that all over the clothes and the hat, making sure it pulls in all those recesses. Next up, I use Agrax Earthshade all over the leather areas, being super careful not to get any on the yellow because it'd be a bit of a nightmare if I had to clean all this up. And like always, I apply some Nuln Oil all over the gunmetal painted parts and some Guilliman Flesh Wash all over the golds. As there are really only 3 large main colours for this mini, I really only had like 3 washes to do, which was a positive, so this step was very quick. Now it's time for the highlights, and like always, I like to get the bigger parts out of the way first, so I'm going to dive straight into the leathers. I still had a bit of half dried bark, half Doombull mix left on the wet palette, so I just went around and cleaned up a few areas first. After this, I used pure Doombull brown over the large raised areas, and as there were 10 leather jackets to get through, I could tell this was going to be a bit of a nightmare. I then mixed in a small amount of Baylor brown to the Doombull brown and started to highlight a smaller area. I did swap out my brush at this point for something a little skinnier to make sure these highlights were a bit more crisp and sharp. To finish, I then used some pure Baylor brown as a skinny edge highlight, and I just do these towards the ends of the jacket and to the top facing sections on the sleeves and the collars. My recipe for black is pretty simple, and I start by applying some Dark Reaper over the shirt frills, the upper part of the legs, and the top facing part on the hat. I do water the Dark Reaper down a little bit and kind of use it as a glaze. If I do get some in the recesses, it's pretty easy to fix up just using some more Abaddon black. I then go back over with sort of a thick line to all the raised areas with Thunderhawk blue, being careful not to cover up too much of that Dark Reaper below it. And to finish, using a skinny brush, I do an edge highlight of rust grey to the top facing areas. This black is a little bit cold, and if I did have my time again, I would have probably opted in for using like a grey tone or a grey highlight or something like that, but you live and you learn. Now I've shown this yellow technique on some previous videos, so we'll keep it pretty quick. I use a mix of half bronze flesh tone by Vallejo and half Uriel yellow for that first highlight all over the raised areas. Then when I'm happy with that, I use pure Uriel yellow over this, but as always, just to a smaller area. I then use a mix of Uriel yellow and Dawn yellow to the top facing areas, and to finish up I use a crisp highlight of just pure Dawn yellow wherever it kind of needs it. Super simple stuff, and it looks pretty bright just the way I like it. Now it's time for the other brown leather parts, and I mix in small amount of bone white to dried bark and build these highlights up. I don't want to go too light with these, so 3 layers should do the trick, and I just apply this to the belts, the shoes and the little pouches. And to finish up, I used some silver over the gunmetal and some polished gold over the Gehenna's gold. Now some of these minis do have arrows like wedged in the ground in front of them, but I opted in to do this later so they didn't get in the way when I was painting, kind of like with the heads. And for this step, I scraped off some of the sand I glued onto my bases earlier and just trimmed the arrows off the sprue and glued them down. I then went back over these with 2 thin coats of wraithbone and cleaned up the bows with this as well. I then mixed up 2/3 contrast medium to 1/3 skeleton horde and applied this all over the bows and the arrows. This just gives the bows and the arrows a really nice ivory look. Time for the feathers, and I mix in a small amount of black to some administratum grey and apply that all over. Just like the reference illustration, I wanted these guys to have a pop of red, so I used corn red just to the tips of the feathers. I then highlight the grey parts with pure administratum grey and mix in small amounts of white just for a final highlight. I really take my time with this because I don't want to get the light grey in the recesses. For the red tips, I highlight everything with Evil Sun Scarlet, then Wild Rider Red, and just do a final highlight of 2 thin coats orange flare just to the tips. Now who doesn't love a bird? I love a good bird, so I'm going to pull out one of my bird books for reference for this poor pheasant that was used as target practice. I give the poor thing a good coat of BC brown all over, and use some Carrick stone just for the chest feather area. For the beak and the legs, I use some Stonewall Grey. I throw in a wash of Agrax Earthshade over everything, and then I highlight the chest with some bone white, mixing in a small amount of white to highlight up, and then I highlight the rest of the feathers with some more beastie brown, and I use a mix of bone white into that just for a final highlight. And to finish, I just mix up a bit of Stonewall Grey and white, and put this on the tip of the beak, and just dot it on the legs. And that was pretty much it, my dudes. 10 Averland Archers of the Empire, fully complete for Anvil of Doom's first video of 2024. Here they are. Thanks so much for sticking around and all the support, guys. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. And maybe share this video with your friends. Let me know down in the comments what you want to see me paint next, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.